welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about book recommendations based off of the track list for the album Virgin by Lorde. I'm a really big Lorde fan. I've been a fan of her since her original days of pure heroin. Definitely a huge melodrama fan. It came out right around the time I was 18, so that coming of age album really hit when I was coming of age, and now Virgin has come out and I am a really big fan of that as well. I did a little bit of research in preparation for this and really wanting to give book recommendations that I felt like did the album justice, and as well as the messages and the meaning that Lorde put behind the album. So I'll for sure link down below some of the articles and videos that I referenced if you're interested to know more about where I got my information from or learn more about the album itself. So before we jump in, I kind of want to reflect on some of the major themes that I noticed in this album. One of the biggest themes that I saw overall was just the concept of intimacy, both intimacy with others in a romantic way as well as a non-romantic way, and especially intimacy with the self. I do think Lorde also offers a little bit of intimacy with the listeners and really, drawing them in and sharing things that are deep and personal and new and fresh, but very real and, raw, opening herself up to critiques on things like her identity, like her relationships with others, like her own gender identity and things like that, which we'll get into. But yeah, and I think allowing for that intimacy helps to make space for a greater theme in this album, which is identity and who am I? Where have I come from versus who am I now? Who am I in relationships? Who am I when I'm alone with myself? Who am I in my body? And so I really wanted to find books that highlighted some of those themes and kind of keep that in mind in general as I was, planning this video. So let's go ahead and jump into the first song on the track list, Hammer. So Hammer is a song that really grapples with identity and coming into a new sense of self that is different from who you used to be, but exciting and new. She, in that chorus, she sings, "I'm ready to feel like I don't have the answers." And so I really wanted to think of books and think of recommendations that went along with that sense of coming into a new sense of self and really figuring out who am I and how do I stay true to this. She mentions in some interviews that she wanted this song to just be fun and playful. I can't say either of my recommendations are too light and breezy of recommendations, but I do think that they hold true to the overall meaning of the song Hammer. So the first recommendation I thought of really reminded me of the overall atmosphere of this song. She really describes just a hot and sweaty day in the summer. This is a great song for the summer, and I think that this is a great hot and sweaty book for the summer. So my first recommendation is Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is a book that takes place roughly in the 80s in Argentina. We get some scenes from before the 80s, some scenes from after. And this book opens with a father and son who are on the road, so to say, after the father and the son have left a cult, essentially. So the father was a part of the cult with the mother, who's no longer in the picture at the start of the book, and he has a special ability to communicate with the dead. So the cult really used him as a means to an end. They really use him they use him for his abilities so that they can get what they want. So as this book starts off, the father is kind of coming to terms with no longer being a part of this cult, no longer wanting to fulfill that role, and figuring out who he is now that he doesn't have that. It kind of turns some of the gender themes that Lorde brings up on his head, where he has a very masculine role, and we do see him as a very masculine presence in the book, but as a single father, he has to try and find these ways to take on a more feminine role. And so I think that it does some really interesting things with gender and with sexuality in this book especially. But the setting, of course, really reminds me of that hot and sweaty atmosphere that's described in Hammer. And we really do see the father take a look at his identity and who he wants to be and how he becomes that. We do, later on in the book, get perspective from the son, also figuring out who he is, unlocking the mystery of where his parents came from and what they dealt with, and figuring out what that means for him and who he wants to be. So I highly recommend Our Share of Night if you want a good, gothic, sweaty, hot chunk of a book for the summer. The next book I want to recommend is, again, not an easy breezy book, and also not really a summer recommendation. I highly recommend this book for the fall. That is going to be Slewfoot by Brom. Slewfoot follows the story of a woman named Abatha, who is a part of a puritanical culture. She was married off by her family to a man she never met, sent to the US to this society, and is now living in it, despite the fact that she's not really accustomed to or a fan of these Puritan ways. So something happens early on where her husband is no longer a part of the picture, and she has to figure out how to make do for herself, how to fend for herself. And so we really follow her grapple with who she wants to be and society pushing back against that. The pre-chorus to Hammer paints a really nice picture that I think captures Slewfoot really well, especially as we get into the introduction of a character around the halfway point. And the pre-chorus says, "Now, I know you don't deal much in love and affection, but I really do think we could make a connection. I burn and I sing and I scheme and I dance." And there's a very particular scene that brings to light for me. I mean, there's a particular character that maybe doesn't deal much in love and affection, but he and Abatha certainly form a relationship. So if you're looking for a good witchy adjacent book for the fall, I highly recommend Slewfoot. So track 2 off of Virgin is What Was That?, which was also the lead single for Virgin. I thought this was a really fun lead single for Lorde to release, and I thought that it paid a lot of odes to melodrama, which is fitting, as she describes this album as almost a second coming of age, and melodrama was a tried and true coming of age album. Lyrically, this song really follows just a pivotal relationship and the fallout from that. And Lorde described the song as being very immediate and very to the point. So when I think of this song and I read lyrics like, "Do you know you're still with me when I'm out with my friends?" Or, "I didn't know that you'd never be enough. Since I was 17, I gave you everything," my mind immediately goes to a very popular novel, which is Normal People by Sally Rooney. Normal People is just about two people who come in and out of each other's lives, and they can never seem to be what the other one needs at the right moment. They can never seem to click those puzzle pieces into place. And it's a really beautiful relationship, and it's a really intimate look at all of the different things that a relationship can be. But every time they kind of come in and out of each other, it leaves them asking, what was that? And they're always reflecting on that other person and on who they are with that person. That being said, Normal People is a fairly popular book. It's fairly well read, so I did want to offer a recommendation that's potentially a little bit more niche. And that recommendation is Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. So I read this earlier this year. Yes. So I read this earlier this year and I was really taken by it. The book opens up with our main character, Wilder, going on summer vacation with his family to Whistler Bay. He's a very internal and shy and self-conscious character. His insecurities leap off the page. But that being said, kind of against his will, he forms this connection with two kids in the area, Nat and Harper. His connection with Nat is instantly, he is the most beautiful boy I've ever seen. Do I want to be him or do I want him? His connection with Harper is very, you're a girl and you're beautiful and I'm a boy, so I have a crush on you now and you're gonna be my girlfriend. He finds out Nat also feels this way about Harper, so they enter this pact to, both will stay hands off unless she chooses one of them. They have this fun, just adolescent summer, swapping folklore for the town, learning about rumored murderers, and, or is it just some kids playing pranks? And they make this pact at the end of the summer that every summer they're going to come back here and they're going to stay friends forever. Of course, they come back the next summer and it is not quite the same. They've grown up a little bit, things have happened in their lives, and they have to grapple with these new things. I don't want to give away too much more of the plot because it does really take off from there, but I will say a little bit further into the book, we follow Wilder when he is in college and he's wanting to become a writer. He enters yet another really intense relationship that leaves him crashing out a little bit, for lack of a better term. And the book really takes off from there into unexplainable places, unexplainable plot. I did finish this book and physically ask myself, what was that? So I will give a caveat that this is definitely a book that's a little bit of a mind labyrinth. However, I highly recommend it. I think it's a really interesting read, and I think that it is a really good read for looking at the fallout from these intensive relationships, you know, romantic and non-romantic, and what impact relationships have on our identity and how we see ourselves. So track 3 off of Virgin is Shapeshifter. This is a really interesting track to me because I think it talks about a lot of things. To kind of reference some of the things Lorde brought up in an interview, the main influence for this track is a piece of art titled Everyone I've Ever Slept With. And it's a tent looking piece of art, and on the inside is the name of every person that the artist has ever slept with, both in a romantic and a non-romantic way. So it could be a hookup, it could be, you know, laying in bed with her grandmother as a child. And Lorde really used that as inspiration for the different roles that we play in life, and especially that women play in life. And, you know, who are we in a relationship? Who am I with my mother? Who am I with my friends? Who am I when I want something? And I think that's a really interesting look at how we use our sense of self to ultimately get to where we want, or to play the role that we want, or how we use our sense of self to get somewhere and we end up in a role that we don't want to be in, but it's maybe our own fault that we're there anyway. So I was trying to reflect on characters or on books that really highlighted just playing different roles and being fluid and being just different things depending on who's there. And the book recommendation I have for that is Pew by Catherine Lacey. So this is a really, really interesting book. I read it in about a day. It's a pretty quick read. So this book starts and our main character Pew is found sleeping in a church pew, and all the churchgoers come in on Sunday and they don't really know what to do about that. They cannot tell if Pew is a man or a woman. They cannot tell what race Pew is. They can't tell what age Pew is. And so because of that, Pew ends up becoming a little bit of a projection of all of these people. There's a lot of religious references in this book. There's a lot of talk about identity and the roles we play and the roles that we expect from ourselves and from others. You know, what type of mold am I expected to fit into in society? And so I think this is a really good recommendation for Shapeshifter because Pew is a shape-shifting character, and Pew takes on a lot of different roles that maybe they did put themselves into because of the circumstances they're in, but maybe they didn't put themselves into because of the society that they're in. So highly recommend Pew by Catherine Lacey. And then a nonfiction recommendation that I have for Shapeshifter is actually Down the Drain by Julia Fox.
Is it fiction? Is it a memoir? What is
No, it's you know, it was like a memoir at first, but now it's just like my first book, you know?
I found this to be a really raw and upfront memoir. She really didn't hold back, and for some people the details may be a little too salacious, but I also think that it was really honest, and I always appreciate a certain level of honesty in a memoir. I think a lot of times people try to paint themselves as the good guy, and it takes a lot of guts to write about when you were the bad guy. So one of the themes that Lorde brings up in Shapeshifter is the things that we use as coping mechanisms, or the things that we use to hide from what we really want to look at. And Julia Fox is really honest about using things like relationships, drugs, partying as coping mechanisms for not knowing who she wants to be, for not wanting to own up to some of the things that she's done. And so I think that that's a really honest memoir. It's got some fun stories, but it does have a lot of heart to it as well. She highlights some of the different roles that she willingly and unwillingly plays, especially in her relationships with men, in order to get where she wants to go or get out of situations she doesn't want to be in. And so I think that Down the Drain is also a really relevant recommendation when it comes to Shapeshifter. is the infamous Man of the Year. Alternative title, Gender. I barely know her. Anyway, so this is a really interesting song because I've seen it get a little bit misinterpreted from its original meaning. So there is the very entertaining TikTok trend of people posting the horrible things their exes have said and done to them with the sound, "Let's hear it for the Man of the Year." But that isn't really true to what this song is about. Lorde talked about how she wrote this song after going to the GQ Man of the Year Awards, and she said she was in just a really feminine get-up, and she walked in and she was like, "This is not me. I'm supposed to be a man tonight. I'm not supposed to be, this isn't what I'm supposed to be right now." And she went home and then she wrote Man of the Year, reflecting on herself being the Man of the Year. So while this has made for some, great TikToks, it really is a reflection of gender and gender identity and, coming to terms with truths about yourself and figuring out how to love yourself regardless. So if you want a book that aligns a little bit more with the TikTok trend of let's hear it for the Man of the Year, just what a guy, I want to recommend the book Cult Classic. Cult Classic follows a woman who is in a long-term relationship that's kind of playing the will we won't we game with long-term commitment. And all of a sudden she starts running into every single one of her exes on the same 3 square blocks in New York City, and sometimes having these conversations with them, and regardless coming up with all of these past memories of why did I end that relationship and what did that relationship mean for me. And some of the relationships that she's in are just, what a guy. Wow. So if you're looking for a book that aligns with the TikTok trend of just reflecting on, can't believe I dated him, I would recommend Cult Classic. I kind of want to recommend Slewfoot again for Man of the Year because the character of Abatha does take on a really masculine role in the book. When she's left on her own, she has to figure out, how do I run the house? How do I run the farm? How do I make a living for myself? How do I make a means for myself? And that is not what the female role is in the society that she's in. And so I've already talked a little bit about Slewfoot at the beginning, but I think this is a great book for breaking out of the typical gender roles. The last book I want to recommend is not one that I've technically finished, but I didn't finish it because it was due back at the library and I wasn't in the right headspace to finish it at the time, and I wanted to do it justice. And that book is Nevada by Imogen Binney. Hi, Editing Elise. I just want to give a little bit of a disclaimer with this recommendation that I am not trying to be insensitive or inconsiderate by recommending a story about a trans woman with a song titled Man of the Year. This song has so many ties, from what I've read about it and from just what I picked up on, to gender identity and gender expression. And I wanted to use this as an opportunity to highlight a trans story by a trans voice. And I just want to clarify that I'm not trying to make any type of comment or be insensitive with the title of the song, because I think that the meaning of the song can be flipped to a trans female perspective and a trans man perspective and a non-binary perspective. And I just wanted to give that little caveat because I never want someone to feel upset or hurt or think that I'm trying to be unkind with this recommendation. So this is a book following a trans girl in New York City who is going through a little bit of a breakup and also just dealing with her own mental space and figuring out who she is in and out of this relationship. I haven't gotten to this part of the book yet, I have to admit, but eventually she leaves this relationship and she goes on kind of a bender of a road trip. If I'm incorrect, like I said, I didn't get that far. This is what I remember from the synopsis. But one of the things that she deals with pretty early on to the book is feeling like she's not actually in love in her relationship. She's just in that relationship because she's comfortable. And she talks a lot about feeling uncomfortable within herself because she's maybe not fully who she wants to be, or because she's not perceived as who she wants to be. And I think that this book really captures what it means to have self-acceptance and work towards self-love, especially the lyric. Especially the lyric, "Who's gonna love me like this?" I think is really reflective of who else is gonna love me the way that I can love myself? Who else is going to accept me the way I'm capable of accepting myself and all of my truths and all of the people that I want to be? The next track off of Virgin is one of my favorites, and that is Favorite Daughter. Favorite Daughter is a song that really reflects on Lorde's relationship with her mother. And, you know, when you're a kid, your mom, ideally, being your biggest cheerleader and watching you grow into the person that you eventually become. Also, then, as you get older, realizing that who your mother is and who your mother was, and that she was her own person this whole time. It was never all about you. And just some of the messiness and beauty that comes from mother-daughter relationships, or you know, general parent-child relationships as well. So my first recommendation is One Italian Summer by Rebecca Sorley. I've heard both pronunciations. So this is about a mother-daughter relationship. At the beginning of this book, our main character, Katie, her mother, Carol, has recently passed away from sickness. So Katie and Carol were about to go on the mother-daughter trip of a lifetime to the Amalfi Coast in Italy. Looked that place up for my honeymoon. Out of the budget, can't swing it. But Katie and Carol were going to go on their mother-daughter trip to the Amalfi Coast. Carol passes away, and Katie decides, you know what, I'm going to go anyway. I'm going to figure out how to deal with my grief. I'm going to do this to feel close to my mother. When she gets there, she sees her mother from 50 some years ago, when her mother went on a solo trip to the Amalfi Coast on her own. And so she has the chance to connect with her mother in a new way when her mother was not her mother, when her mother was her own person. And throughout the course of this book, we see kind of the beauty of mother-daughter relationships, but also some of the strain that comes on it, especially when there's too much pressure from one party or the other. And we see what it means to realize that your mother is her own person outside of just being a mother. So I think this is a really great, yet somewhat emotional read for the summer. One of the lyrics that really resonates with me when thinking of this book is, "Everywhere I run, I'm always running to ya," because this character, Katie, really has that deep connection with her mother, where it feels like everything she does, she's got her mom and what she wants to be for her mom in her mind. The next recommendation I have that's maybe not as light and fun of a book is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. So this is a graphic novel memoir and also a musical, if any of you are fans of those. And this is a book detailing the author coming of age from a child to a young woman and realizing who she is. You can see the theme of identity coming up in every recommendation, but especially realizing who she is in her sexuality, realizing that she is queer, and realizing just all of the things about herself, all of the signs along the way, and, you know, what led her to these realizations, and how does she live with that now that she knows it to be. Along the way, she also reflects on her relationship with her father and realizing that he was queer as well. And you see a lot of similarities between Allison and her father, as well as a lot of differences. One of the lyrics that really made me think of Fun Home is when Lorde says, "Scared of your anger, in love with your whim." There are so many things that Allison in this book, you can tell she loves about her dad and admires, and she wants to be like him. But at the same time, she is scared of those darker parts. She's scared of the times when he's distant, when he's angry, when he's not the typical father figure that's, you know, warm and fuzzy. And so this is a book definitely with some darker themes. I do want to give a trigger warning for suicide, but it's a really beautiful book, and it's a really beautiful, true story. And especially if you've never read a graphic novel, I think this is a really good one to read as your first one. If you're more of a literary, character-driven, memoir reader, I highly recommend Fun Home. Okay, the next song on the track list is a very intimate song, Current Affairs. So Current Affairs is a song about intimacy. It's a song about being with another person and really connecting on those deeper levels. Lorde talks about just navigating all of the different physical and emotional entanglements that come with intimate relationships. And she talks about how this was a really vulnerable song for her to put out, because she was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm saying these things. I can't believe I'm admitting these things. And because of that, I thought of one book in particular that I read this year that I really loved. So the book I want to recommend for current affairs is Little Rabbit by Alyssa Songsiradej. I looked up a couple of pronunciations and they were all different, so I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly. This is a debut novel about a taboo relationship, and it is a phenomenal debut. It is an incredibly strong debut. So we follow our nameless main character, who is only known to us by Little Rabbit, as she enters a relationship with a man we only know as the choreographer. And this relationship enters the taboo in their intimate lives and explores what that looks like. We see some really interesting dynamics between Little Rabbit and the choreographer, but also between her and her best friend, who doesn't really have an understanding for their relationship. This is a very intimate book in the physical relationship sense, but also just, it's a book that is held very close. You're really let in on small moments. And I think it's a really just beautiful depiction of a relationship, with just a really satisfying ending to the book. Especially the lyric, "Don't know how to come back once I'm out on the edge." I think that really captures how this main character ends up feeling about the relationship. Once she's seen what could be, she doesn't know how to return to what she knew before. So this is the only recommendation that I have for current affairs, but I honestly think it's the perfect recommendation. Little Rabbit. So our next song is Clear Blue. This is a song that follows the moments after an intimate encounter where essentially Lorde is worried she might be pregnant. She's taking a Clear Blue test. And while that's literally what she's describing, in a deeper sense, in the more metaphorical sense, what she's describing is that moment of limbo and uncertainty when you don't know what's going to come next. It's Schrodinger's pregnancy test. Like you could be pregnant or you could not be, and you don't know until you know. And that moment of limbo and just kind of the chaos that lives in that small moment where, she describes she could be free. She might be free next. And so I tried to think about books that captured that just like bottled up chaos that is set to explode at some point. There's set to be a release, but you're just living in that moment of chaos. So the first recommendation I have for this is a translated work called Fish Swimming in Dappled Sunlight by Riku Onda. This is a Japanese work about a couple on the last night of their relationship. Their apartment's been packed up, everything's gone, they're sharing one final meal together, and just kind of having one last night, knowing that they're about to go their separate ways. I kind of want to leave you there because there are plot elements that come up that I never could have predicted. I felt like I was like, oh, that's juicy, and then I was like, oh, I don't really like that, and then I was like, oh, wait a minute, we're back, and then, oh, we are not back at all. And so it's a really interesting book. I don't think it's going to be for everyone, but I do think that it's a really good book for capturing that just bubble of chaos and waiting for it to burst. And it does burst, and maybe you're left with a feeling of freedom, or maybe you're left feeling like everything, all the pieces flew out of place. Another recommendation that I have for Clear Blue that I feel like captures the moments of obsession and keep saying chaos, but I can't think of a better word. The moments when you don't know and you're just so wrapped up in the thing is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. So this details Constanta, who is the bride of Dracula, and this is an obsessive and moody and dark relationship that she knows ultimately is not good for her. And so I thought of this book a lot when she starts repeating, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free, but still not quite knowing what that freedom means in Clear Blue. And I feel like we do really see that in the character of Constanta. in the character of Constanta, of wanting that freedom but not knowing what to do with it when she gets it, and not knowing if she even wants it, and if she wants to go back, and just that obsession and that chaos of life in a bubble. So that is A Dowry of Blood. The next song on the track list is Grown Woman, GRWM. And Lorde described this as being just a fun song, just about being a girl, going out on the town, and just owning that. But especially coming into who you want to be, being on that cusp of girlhood and womanhood, and riding that line, and just kind of embracing that femininity and embracing just who you are and who you want to be. So the first recommendation I have for that's maybe a little bit lighter, but definitely deals with figuring out who you are and really owning up to that, is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. I don't know that Virgin is necessarily a fantastical album. I don't know that it lends itself to a lot of fantasy novels, but I think that this is a really unique one that follows our main character Tress as she leaves her ordinary life and her ordinary home for the first time ever and goes on this grand adventure for herself and for what she wants and for the sake of friendship. And I think that Grown Women really relates to this theme of I'm gonna be me for me, and we get to see Tress do that in this novel. Next book that is a little bit more of a classic, but I think also really, really captures that feeling of being on the cusp of girlhood and womanhood, is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is one of my favorite classics. It's one of my favorite novels, and it is just a beautiful story of seeing who you could be, who you are, who you might be right now, but you're not really sure and you don't know if you're doing it right, with all of the pressure from the outside world of who you should be as well. So we follow our unnamed main character as she enters a relationship with a much older man and has to essentially take over his household and become the new Mrs. De Winter after the mysterious passing of his wife. And it really feels like his first wife, Rebecca, is haunting this home, Manderley, and just she's everywhere, and our new Mrs. De Winter cannot get away from her. And I feel like this main character feels like she has to fulfill this role that Rebecca held and this figure that Rebecca was, and she's really, as Laura says, looking around for a grown woman and looking around for that guidance of how do I become her, how do I be her. And this story is so much more than that. This is such a deep and compelling novel, but I do think if you're looking for a book with a main character on that line of girlhood and womanhood, Rebecca is a great option. The next song off of Virgin that we're going to talk about is Broken Glass. Lorde specifically says that this song, it took a lot to bring this song out of her and to kind of admit to it and put it out. And it's a really, really vulnerable song about an eating disorder and about coping and just that level of addiction. Obviously, an eating disorder is different from an addiction in a lot of ways, but there are still those similar tendencies of going back to something against your will that you don't want to be drawn to. So I found a really great quote from a Billboard article that I want to just kind of read verbatim because I think it captures this song really well. And this quote says, "Lorde recounts the sadness, self-loathing, addictive qualities of hopelessness associated with counting calories and obsessing over appearance." And I wanted to find some books that really dealt with obsessing over those things that take us away from ourselves or that we use as an escape. I don't have any books that are specifically related to dealing with an eating disorder. I don't read a lot of books about eating disorders, so I don't want to, recommend in good faith something that I don't have much knowledge about, especially on with what can be a rather triggering topic. So these books in general deal more so with not fully accepting who you are and the things that we do to run away from dealing with ourselves in a way. So the first one is kind of a YA classic. I read this growing up. I reread it last year. That is Looking for Alaska by John Green. This book follows our main character Miles as he goes to a boarding school in Alabama, and he meets a whole bunch of other students. The main focus of our story being Alaska. And Alaska is definitely a bit of a manic pixie dream girl in Miles' eyes, but I think that the book is really honest with itself about that. I don't think the book is unaware of the fact that Miles treats her that way, especially in the latter half. I think he has to confront the role that she played in his life and a role that he put on her that she maybe wasn't actually fulfilling. But our main character of Alaska, we definitely see her use whatever she can to run away from herself, and I think that that really captures the elements of Broken Glass. Lorde talks about, I want to punch the mirror to make her see that this won't last. And Alaska knows that she is running herself into the ground. She knows that the things she is doing to herself and to her body are not sustainable and are not good for her. And we see her have these moments of knowing this can't last. But we also see her not want to let go of the things that help her escape. That is Looking for Alaska. The next more recent adult release that I want to talk about that deals with the things we do to get away from ourselves is The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. I read this in June while I was on my family trip to Ireland. It is an Irish author. It takes place in Ireland. And it was a really great book. I highly recommend it. There's a little bit of a longer book, but I thought it was really phenomenal. We follow 4 members of a family while a recession is going on around them, and their finances are breaking down, but also their interpersonal lives. And we see what happens when these characters are they have such walls up to prevent themselves from getting hurt that they make themselves so lonely, and these walls end up being some of the things that hurt them the most. We see the daughter run away from the fear of not meeting expectations by falling into a bit of an addiction with alcohol. We see the mother figure go into hyper-management in order to avoid dealing with her reality and, what her life has become. We see the father just throw himself into whatever he can to hide from the truths about himself. And we see the younger brother trying to hold them all together and trying to hold himself together, and have to force himself to grow up before he wants to. So this is a really beautiful story of family and loneliness and just how the choices we make impact everything down the line. So highly recommend The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. So the next track list off of Virgin is If She Could See Me Now. And this is really a song about reflecting on who you were when you were wrapped up in a certain relationship and really ruminating on that and reliving the memories, but also seeing where you are now. One of the lyrics that really stood out to me from If She Could See Me Now was when Lorde says, "It made me a woman, being hurt like that. Whenever you'd break me, I'd watch like an angel looking down." And I think that an interesting recommendation for If She Could See Me Now is Boulder by Eva Baltazar. So this is a translated work that follows our main character Boulder as she enters a relationship with another woman. They come into each other's lives in a unique way, and they continue on in each other's lives in a really unique way and are forced to confront, playing roles that maybe they didn't want to play. They hurt themselves in a lot of ways because of their expectations on the other person and because of what they want from the other person. And so I think that our main character Boulder definitely has these moments later on in the book of just ruminating and reflecting on this relationship and what it did to her, and how that relationship has changed her over the course of her life. So that is Boulder by Eva Baltazar. All right, and our final song off of Virgin is David. I think this is a really strong closing track. I think it really captures that feeling of intimacy that is such a through line throughout the album. And I think that it's really honest and raw and true. So this song really discusses a relationship that hasn't worked, a partner that has let her down or failed her in a lot of ways, and coming to the realization that her identity is not someone else's. Her identity is her own, and what does that mean if I'm my own person and I'm not this person's person? Which I think is something that happens to a lot of people when you exit a really formative and a really pivotal relationship, is you have to discover who you are again on your own outside of that relationship. So I really like that she has a song that captures, like, I'm on my own and I'm going to be me and I'm going to be fine, but also am I ever going to find love again? Because what do I do now? Where do I go from here? And so something that I kind of reflected on with this song is just, am I ever going to love again? Am I ever going to feel right in this world again? And so a recommendation that I have for that kind of feeling is Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna McGuire. This is book 1 in the Wayward Children series. If you were like me and assumed because it says children in the title that this is a middle grade series, rest assured it is not. It is an adult series, but it's one of the shorter books I've recommended on this list. So the essence of the Wayward Children series is that there are these kids who just don't fit in this world, and one day a door opens, they enter it, and they enter the alternative fantasy world that is perfect for them, that is where they're meant to be. And for some reason or another, some of these kids leave that world, or they are removed from it, and they don't know how to get back to it, but they're back in our world again, and nothing feels right. And for a lot of these kids, they get sent to this home for wayward children where they're surrounded by other kids who have gone through this same thing of being in the one place that feels right and feels true and not being able to get back there. And so these kids have to think about and work on, do I accept my circumstance? Do I figure out how to move on? Do I figure out how to love again, how to be again? Or do I stay in this space of always longing to go back to what was? And I think that is a really unique tie-in to the song David, is just that feeling of, am I ever going to love again? Am I ever going to feel right again after my total worldview has changed, after my total sense of self has changed? And so that is my recommendation for David. That is all of my recommendations for the tracklist to Virgin by Lorde. I was a really big fan of this album. I just enjoyed the sounds. I enjoyed doing some research and learning a little bit more and, analyzing the lyrics. I really tried hard to only recommend books that I have read and I've can recommend in good faith. So if you feel like I missed something or you have a better recommendation, feel free to leave those recommendations in the comments or tell me why I'm wrong. I'd love to just talk more about this album and talk more about these books, and I hope you like these recommendations. Bye.